The crowd at Abigail Grayson's public shaming fell silent as Marshal Thompson read the charges against her, his voice carrying across the dusty main street of Prosperity, Wyoming territory in the spring of 1871. She stood on the wooden platform with her head bowed, the weight of 23 years of life seeming to crush her slender shoulders beneath her once fine blue dress, now worn and travel-stained. For the crimes of theft and deception, Abigail Grayson is hereby banished from our town, the marshal proclaimed, his gray mustache twitching with disapproval. Let this serve as a warning to all who would violate the trust of decent folk. Tears streaked down Abigail's dirt-smudged cheeks, but she refused to make a sound. The whispers had already started, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Thief! Liar! Always knew there was something not right about her. It didn't matter that she'd stolen that bread because she hadn't eaten in 3 days. It didn't matter that she'd lied about her name when she first arrived because she was running from the memories of a family lost to influenza. All that mattered was that Prosperity had found her wanting, and Prosperity was casting her out. As the crowd began to disperse, their entertainment concluded, Abigail caught sight of Mrs. Holloway, the baker's wife, who had once shown her kindness, turning away with disappointment etched on her face. The final betrayal broke something inside her. "No one will want me now," she cried, her voice cracking with despair as she collapsed to her knees on the rough wooden planks. From the edge of the crowd, a tall figure stepped forward. The setting sun cast his features in shadow, but there was no mistaking the confident stride of a man accustomed to hard living on the frontier. His spurs jingled with each step as he approached the platform, ignoring the murmurs that followed him. Weston Tanner was not a man who concerned himself with the opinions of others. At 30 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life driving cattle across the untamed wilderness, keeping to himself and building a modest ranch 10 miles outside of town. Few knew him well, but all recognized the quiet strength in his weathered face and the integrity in his clear blue eyes. He stopped at the foot of the platform and removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair. "Miss Grayson," he called, his voice low but firm. Abigail looked up, wiping tears away with the back of her hand. She recognized the rancher, having seen him in town on occasion, but they had never spoken. "I've been waiting my whole life for you," the cowboy said simply, extending a calloused hand toward her. Gasps rippled through the remaining onlookers. Marshal Thompson stepped forward with a scowl. "Tanner, this woman is being banished. You'd do well to—" "I heard the charges," Weston interrupted, his eyes never leaving Abigail's face. "And I'm offering her a place to go." "You can't be serious," someone called from the crowd. Weston finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the townsfolk with quiet challenge. "I need a housekeeper at my ranch. Miss Grayson needs somewhere to go. It's an honest arrangement." Abigail stared at him in disbelief. This had to be some cruel joke, some further humiliation designed to break her completely. Yet something in his steady gaze spoke of sincerity. "Why would you help me?" she whispered, too softly for anyone but him to hear. His answer was equally quiet. "Everyone deserves a second chance." Marshal Thompson huffed his disapproval, but could find no legal reason to object. "On your head be it, Tanner. If she steals from you or worse, don't come crying to me." "She won't," Weston said with such conviction that Abigail almost believed it herself. With trembling legs, she stood and descended the platform steps, conscious of the stairs following her every movement. Pride made her straighten her back despite her shame. When she reached Weston's side, he placed his hat back on his head and nodded toward the livery stable. "My wagon's this way." The journey to Weston Tanner's ranch passed in uncomfortable silence. Abigail sat rigid on the wagon seat, clutching her small bundle of possessions as they left Prosperity behind. The setting sun painted the vast Wyoming landscape in hues of gold and amber, the rolling hills stretching toward distant mountains still capped with late spring snow. "You don't have to stay," Weston said finally, breaking the silence as they traveled along the rutted dirt road. "If you want to leave come morning, I'll give you enough money to reach the next town. Abigail glanced at him, trying to understand his motives. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know enough. His hands remained steady on the reins as the horses pulled them farther from town. I know what it's like to be judged by your worst mistake. She wanted to ask what mistakes he had made, what secrets he carried, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she watched as the landscape changed, becoming wilder and more beautiful with each passing mile. It's not much, Weston said as they crested a hill and his ranch came into view in the valley below. A modest two-story house stood surrounded by several outbuildings. A corral held a handful of horses, and beyond, Abigail could see the silhouettes of cattle grazing on the rolling grassland that stretched to the horizon. It wasn't the grandest ranch she had seen, but there was something about its rugged simplicity that spoke of hard work and honest living. It's more than I deserve, she whispered, her voice catching. Weston gave her a sidelong glance but said nothing as he guided the wagon down the slope toward the house. As they drew closer, a bark announced their arrival, and a large black and white border collie came bounding from behind the house, followed by a lanky young man. That's Bandit, Weston explained as the dog raced alongside the wagon, and that's Isaac Turner, my ranch hand. Only 17, but works harder than most men twice his age. Isaac approached with obvious curiosity as Weston halted the wagon. His freckled face betrayed his youth, but his eyes held a maturity beyond his years. Didn't expect you back before dark, Mr. Tanner, Isaac said, his gaze shifting to Abigail with undisguised interest. Isaac, this is Miss Grayson. She'll be taking over the housekeeping duties, Weston explained as he climbed down from the wagon. He reached up to offer Abigail assistance, which she accepted after a moment's hesitation. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Grayson, Isaac said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. You as well, Abigail responded quietly, feeling the weight of her shame even here, miles from prosperity. Isaac, would you mind seeing to the horses? Weston asked. I'll show Miss Grayson to her quarters. The house was simple but well built, with a large kitchen and living area downstairs and bedrooms above. Everything was clean but Spartan, clearly the home of a man who valued function over comfort. You'll have the room at the end of the hall, Weston said as he led her upstairs. It gets good light in the morning. The room was small but neat, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window overlooking the western hills. Someone had placed a vase of wildflowers on the windowsill, their bright colors a stark contrast to the plain surroundings. Isaac must have put those there, Weston commented, noticing her gaze. He's a thoughtful boy. Abigail set her bundle on the bed, feeling oddly like an intruder. What exactly will my duties entail, Mr. Tanner? Weston, he corrected. Just cooking and keeping the house in order. Isaac and I handle the ranch work. He paused, watching her carefully. I meant what I said in town. If you want to leave tomorrow, you can. But if you stay, you'll be treated with respect here. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tighten. Why did you say that? She asked suddenly. In town, when I said no one would want me. Why did you say you'd been waiting your whole life for me? A shadow of something embarrassment perhaps crossed his face. It seemed like the right thing to say at the time. To give you some dignity back in front of those people. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. I'll leave you to get settled. Supper's usually at sundown, but after your day, I expect you'd rather rest. There's bread and preserves in the pantry if you get hungry. Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the stairs. Abigail sank onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up to her. She had gone from condemned to employed in the span of an hour, all because of a man she barely knew. As the sun set beyond her window, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue, Abigail wondered if she'd escaped one prison only to enter another. Yet, as she listened to the distant lowing of cattle and the soft night sounds of the prairie, a fragile hope began to bloom in her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was the second chance she so desperately needed. The morning light streamed through the window, waking Abigail from a fitful sleep. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling. Then, the memories rushed back: the public shaming, Weston Tanner's unexpected intervention, the journey to his ranch. She sat up quickly, realizing she had fallen asleep fully dressed atop the covers. The house below was quiet as she splashed water on her face from the basin on the dresser and attempted to smooth her rumpled dress. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a face marked by fatigue and worry, her once vibrant auburn hair dull and tangled. Taking a deep breath, she pinned it back as neatly as possible and prepared to face her new reality. Downstairs, the kitchen was empty, but bore signs of a hasty breakfast. Unwashed cups sat on the table alongside a half-eaten loaf of bread. Through the window, Abigail could see Weston and Isaac in the distance, working with the horses in the corral. Grateful for the momentary solitude, she took stock of her surroundings. The kitchen was well equipped, but showed a distinct lack of feminine touches. The cast-iron stove was clean, but had clearly seen better days. The pantry, when she investigated, contained basic staples: flour, sugar, coffee, beans, but lacked the variety of ingredients she was accustomed to working with. Despite the shortcomings, Abigail felt a sense of purpose stirring within her. If she was to stay, and where else could she go? She would earn her keep. Setting aside her uncertain future, she rolled up her sleeves and set to work. By mid-morning, the kitchen was transformed. The dishes were washed, the table scrubbed, and the smell of fresh bread baking filled the air. Abigail had discovered eggs in the henhouse behind the main building and had set a pot of bean soup to simmer for the midday meal. The screen door creaked open, and Weston entered, removing his hat as he stepped inside. He paused, taking in the changes to his kitchen with evident surprise. "You've been busy," he observed, his eyes lingering on the loaves cooling on the counter. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious. "I hope I haven't overstepped. I thought I should start earning my keep." A small smile touched his lips. "No complaints here. It's been a while since this place smelled so good." An awkward silence fell between them as Weston stood uncertainly in his own kitchen. Abigail was struck again by the contradiction of the man so confident in his element outdoors, yet somehow ill at ease in this domestic setting. "The soup will be ready soon," she offered, "and the bread should be cool enough to cut by then." He nodded, seeming relieved to have a practical matter to discuss. "Isaac and I were planning to check the north pasture this afternoon. We'll likely be back before sundown." "I'll have supper waiting," Abigail promised. Weston hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and replaced his hat before heading back outside. As the door closed behind him, Abigail let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. There was something about Weston Tanner that unsettled her, not in a frightening way, but in a manner that made her acutely aware of herself. Perhaps it was simply the strangeness of their arrangement or the lingering shame of her circumstances. Whatever the reason, she was grateful for the distraction of work. The days fell into a pattern. Abigail rose early to prepare breakfast for Weston and Isaac before they headed out for their ranch duties. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, mending, and gradually bringing order to the bachelor household. In the evenings, they would eat together, conversation slowly becoming less strained as they grew accustomed to one another's presence. Isaac, with the resilience of youth, was the first to accept her completely. He eagerly shared stories of his day's work and expressed exuberant appreciation for her cooking. "Miss Grayson, these biscuits would make angels weep," he declared one evening, reaching for his third helping. Weston was more reserved, but Abigail occasionally caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, perhaps, or simple curiosity. He never mentioned the incident in town, for which she was thankful. It was as if by unspoken agreement, her past remained in prosperity while she constructed a new present on his ranch. A week passed, then two. Spring advanced across the prairie, bringing wildflowers and longer days. Abigail found herself settling into a routine that, while demanding, offered a peace she had not known in years. The physical labor left her too tired to dwell on regrets, and the isolated location meant she was spared the judging eyes of strangers. One evening, as Abigail was hanging laundry to dry in the warm spring breeze, she became aware of Weston approaching from the barn. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun. "Need any help?" he asked, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm nearly finished," she replied, securing a shirt to the line. "How was your day?" "Productive. We moved the pregnant heifers to the south pasture. Better grass there." Abigail nodded, pinning the last garment before turning to face him fully. In the golden light of sunset, his features seemed softer somehow, the lines of hardship less pronounced. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time since she'd arrived. "Are you planning to stay?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. "Do you want me to?" "That's not what I asked." She looked away, gathering her thoughts. "I don't have many options, Mr. Tanner." "Weston," he corrected gently. "And that's not an answer either." A slight breeze lifted a strand of hair from her face as she considered how to respond. The truth was, she had been avoiding this very question, focusing instead on the immediate tasks of each day. "I'd like to stay," she admitted finally, "if my work is satisfactory." "More than satisfactory." He shifted his weight, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "But I want you to stay because you want to, not because you feel trapped." The distinction touched something deep within her. How long had it been since anyone had cared what she wanted? "I want to stay," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I feel useful here." Weston nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Good. Then we should discuss a proper wage." "A wage?" Abigail blinked in surprise. "But I thought—" "That room and board were payment enough?" He shook his head. "No, Abigail. Your work has value, and you should be compensated fairly for it." She felt a rush of emotion at his matter-of-fact declaration of her worth. "Thank you," she managed, struggling to maintain her composure. "Nothing to thank me for, just good business." But the warmth in his eyes belied the practical tone of his words. "We can settle on an amount tomorrow. For now, I believe there's apple pie waiting inside." "There is," she confirmed, grateful for the shift to safer ground. As they walked back to the house together, Abigail felt something shift between them, a tentative trust beginning to take root. She was still deeply conscious of the debt she owed him, but his insistence on paying her fairly had transformed their relationship from one of charity to one of mutual respect. That night, as she prepared for bed, Abigail caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed different somehow, still bearing the shadows of her past, but with a newfound steadiness in her gaze. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Abigail Grayson allowed herself to imagine a future. The summer heat settled over the Wyoming territory, bringing long days of endless blue skies and evening thunderstorms that rumbled across the prairie. Abigail's life at the Tanner Ranch had developed a comfortable rhythm that soothed her spirit and gradually eased the burden she carried. With her first wages, she had purchased fabric in town, Isaac acting as her proxy since she was still unwilling to face the residents of prosperity. From this, she sewed herself 2 new dresses, simple but sturdy, better suited to ranch life than her increasingly tattered town clothes. The kitchen garden she had started in late spring now flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that transformed their meals. Weston had commented more than once on how the house had changed since her arrival, becoming more of a home than simply a place to sleep and eat. On a particularly hot July afternoon, Abigail was picking green beans when she heard the sound of approaching riders. Setting aside her basket, she shaded her eyes against the sun to see Weston and Isaac returning earlier than expected, accompanied by a third rider. As they drew closer, her heart sank. The distinctive star on the third man's vest identified him immediately Marshall Thompson from Prosperity. Instinctively, Abigail stepped back toward the house, her hard-won peace suddenly threatened. She had known this day might come, when her past would catch up to her new life, but facing it now filled her with dread. Weston dismounted first, his expression unreadable as he approached her. "Abigail," he said quietly, Marshal Thompson wants to speak with you. I told him you've been working here honestly these past months." She nodded, trying to calm her racing heart as the lawman tied his horse to the hitching post and approached. His weathered face set in stern lines. "Miss Grayson," he acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "Marshal," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "What brings you out this way?" Thompson glanced at Weston before answering. "Came to deliver some news that concerns you. Might be better discussed in private." Before Abigail could respond, Weston stepped slightly closer to her side. "Anything you have to say to Miss Grayson can be said in front of me." The possessive note in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through Abigail, despite her anxiety. The marshal's bushy eyebrows rose slightly, but he didn't argue. "Very well, Miss Grayson, it's come to light that Mr. Harrington, the general store owner, has been tampering with his ledgers. Several customers have been falsely accused of not paying their accounts." Abigail's knees weakened as understanding dawned. "And I was one of them," she whispered. Thompson nodded. "You and 3 others. His new clerk found discrepancies and brought them to my attention." He cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The town council has rescinded your banishment. You're free to return to prosperity if you wish." The world seemed to tilt around her. The theft she had been accused of taking goods without paying her account had been the storekeeper's deception, not hers. The public shame, the loss of her position as the schoolteacher's assistant, the whispers and accusations, all based on a lie. "I see," she said, her voice distant to her own ears. "There's more," Thompson continued. "The council has authorized a public apology and restitution for lost wages." Weston's hand came to rest lightly at the small of her back, a steadying presence as she absorbed this unexpected reversal of fortune. "Thank you for bringing this news, Marshal," he said. "I'm sure Miss Grayson needs time to consider her response." Thompson nodded, seeming relieved to have delivered his message. "Of course, I'll be heading back to town now." "Stay for some coffee at least," Weston offered, his innate hospitality asserting itself despite the circumstances. "You've had a long ride." While Weston saw to the marshal's refreshment, Abigail retreated to the garden, needing solitude to process the news. The vindication she had longed for had finally arrived, but instead of the pure joy she might have expected, her emotions were a tangled mess. She was still sitting among the bean plants when Weston found her an hour later, the marshal having departed. "Are you all right?" he asked, lowering himself to sit beside her on the ground, heedless of his work clothes. "I don't know what I am," she admitted, plucking a leaf and turning it over in her fingers. "I should be happy. But I'm angry," she confessed, the emotion finally crystallizing. "All those people who were so quick to believe the worst of me, who watched me being shamed and did nothing." Her voice caught. "And now they think a public apology makes it right?" Weston remained silent, letting her work through her feelings. "The worst part is, I'm tempted to go back," she continued softly, "to hold my head high and make them face what they did." She looked up at him, conflict clear in her eyes. "Does that make me petty?" "It makes you human," he replied simply. "You were wronged. It's natural to want some kind of justice." "What would you do?" she asked. He considered the question seriously, his gaze moving to the distant hills. "I'd decide what matters most to me now, not what mattered then." The wisdom in his words struck her forcefully. What did matter most to her now? The garden she had planted? The kitchen that had become her domain? The quiet evenings when Weston would sometimes read aloud from one of his books while she mended? Or was it the man himself, with his steadfast integrity and the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice? "I don't have to decide right away, do I?" she asked finally. "No," he assured her. "Take all the time you need." He paused, seeming to struggle with his next words. "Just know that there's a place for you here, for as long as you want it." The sincerity in his voice brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat in companionable silence as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the garden, the unspoken growing between them like the plants Abigail had so carefully tended. That evening, as Abigail prepared supper, her mind continued to circle the marshal's news. The rhythmic chopping of vegetables provided a counterpoint to her thoughts as she weighed her options. "Need any help?" Isaac asked, poking his head into the kitchen. She smiled at the young man who had become something of a little brother to her over the past months. "You could set the table if you don't mind." As he arranged the plates and utensils, Isaac cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Tanner told me about what the marshal said, that you could go back to town now." "He did," Isaac nodded, his freckled face serious. "I just wanted to say I hope you don't go. Things wouldn't be the same around here without you." The simple honesty of his statement touched her. "Thank you, Isaac. That means a great deal to me." "Mr. Tanner feels the same way," Isaac added with the directness of youth. "He doesn't say it, but anyone with eyes can see it." Abigail felt her cheeks warm. "Isaac, that's hardly appropriate." "It's true, though," he insisted. "He was always a fair boss, but he was, I don't know, lonelier before. Now he actually smiles sometimes." Before Abigail could formulate a response, the subject of their conversation entered the kitchen, bringing with him the scent of the outdoors and the fading light of evening. "Something smells good," Weston remarked, washing his hands at the basin. "Venison stew," Abigail replied, grateful for the change of subject. "From the deer you brought in yesterday." Dinner passed pleasantly, with Isaac regaling them with tales of his exploits, breaking a particularly stubborn colt. As always, Abigail found herself observing Weston when his attention was elsewhere, noting the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the strong line of his jaw, the careful way he listened when others spoke. After the meal, when Isaac had gone to check on the horses one last time before turning in, Abigail and Weston lingered at the table over coffee. "I've been thinking about the marshal's news," she said finally, gathering her courage. Weston's posture tensed almost imperceptibly. "And I think I would like to go into town," she said carefully. "Not to stay, but to face them, to hear their apology and then leave with my head held high." She took a deep breath. "And then I'd like to come back here." The relief that washed over his features was unmistakable. "You're sure?" "Yes," she said with growing confidence. "What I've found here is worth more than any vindication prosperity could offer me." The look that passed between them held a wealth of unspoken meaning. Weston reached across the table, his calloused fingers gently covering her smaller hand. "I'm glad," he said simply, but his eyes conveyed much more. In that moment, with the soft glow of the oil lamp casting golden light across the kitchen table, Abigail acknowledged to herself what she had been gradually realizing for weeks. She was falling in love with Weston Tanner not out of gratitude or desperation, but because of the man he was. Strong yet gentle, principled yet compassionate, and utterly refreshingly genuine in a world that had shown her so much falsehood. Whether he could ever return such feelings remained uncertain, but as his hand remained warm upon hers, Abigail allowed herself to hope. The journey to prosperity the following week was a quiet one. Weston drove the wagon, with Abigail seated beside him in her best dress, a deep blue calico she had sewn herself, with a matching bonnet to shade her face. They spoke little, both lost in their own thoughts as the familiar landmarks of the road appeared and receded. As they approached the town, Abigail's anxiety mounted. She hadn't set foot in prosperity since the day of her shame, and the prospect of facing those who had condemned her left her stomach in knots despite her determination. "We don't have to do this," Weston said softly as the first buildings came into view. "We can turn around right now." Abigail straightened her shoulders. "No, I need to do this." The town was much as she remembered it, the wide main street flanked by wooden buildings, the church spire rising in the distance, the bustle of commerce and conversation that defined frontier settlements. As Weston guided the wagon down the street, heads turned. Recognition dawned on faces, followed by surprise, discomfort, and in some cases, shame. They stopped in front of the marshal's office. Before Weston could assist her, Abigail gathered her courage and descended from the wagon on her own, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. Marshal Thompson met them at the door, his expression a mixture of official decorum and personal discomfort. "Miss Grayson, Mr. Tanner, the town council is assembled in the meeting room at the hotel." "Then let's not keep them waiting," Abigail replied with more confidence than she felt. The hotel's meeting room was crowded with the prominent citizens of Prosperity. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers, rose as they entered. Mr. Harrington, the disgraced shopkeeper, was notably absent. "Miss Grayson," the mayor began, his tone overly formal, "on behalf of the town council and the citizens of Prosperity, I wish to extend our sincere apologies for the grave injustice done to you." Abigail stood tall, acutely aware of Weston's solid presence just behind her right shoulder. "I accept your apology, Mayor Wilson." The mayor nodded, seeming relieved at her composure. "We have prepared a document acknowledging the error and your complete exoneration." He gestured to a paper on the table before him. "Additionally, we are prepared to offer restitution in the amount of $50 for lost wages and damages to your reputation." A murmur ran through the assembled council members at the sum, a substantial amount by frontier standards. "Furthermore," Mayor Wilson continued, clearing his throat, "the position of assistant to Miss Sullivan at the school remains open. We would be honored if you would consider returning to it." The offer caught Abigail by surprise. She had loved teaching the children, finding joy in their curiosity and progress. For a moment she wavered, the pull of returning to a profession she valued tugging against her desire to return to the ranch, to return to Weston. "That's very generous," she replied carefully. "However, I have commitments elsewhere that I intend to honor." Disappointment flashed across several faces, including Miss Sullivan's, who sat near the back of the room. The schoolteacher had been one of the few to express doubt about Abigail's guilt, though not publicly enough to make a difference. "I understand," the mayor said. "The position will remain open should you change your mind. Now, if you'll just sign this document acknowledging receipt of the restitution." As Abigail stepped forward to sign, the door to the meeting room opened. Mrs. Holloway, the baker's wife, entered hesitantly, her round face flushed with emotion. "Forgive the interruption," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I couldn't let this moment pass without speaking personally." She turned to Abigail, tears welling in her kind eyes. "My dear, I am so deeply sorry for believing the worst of you. You were always so good to my Charlie, helping him with his letters when others had given up on him. I should have known better." The sincere remorse in the older woman's voice touched Abigail more deeply than the official apology had. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway," she said softly. "How is Charlie's reading coming along?" "He struggles still," the baker's wife admitted. "No one has your patience with him." Other voices joined in then, individual apologies and expressions of regret. Miss Sullivan approached to clasp Abigail's hands and speak of how sorely she was missed at the school. Mr. Peterson, the livery stable owner, gruffly acknowledged that his horses had never been so well cared for as when Abigail had tended to them during her brief employment there. As the personal connections were renewed and mended, Abigail felt the last of her bitterness begin to dissolve. These people had been quick to judge, yes, but they were also capable of acknowledging their error. They were flawed, but not malicious, much like herself. When the formalities were concluded and the restitution paid, Abigail and Weston stepped back onto the street, the midday sun bright overhead. "You handled that with grace," Weston commented as they walked toward the general store, now under new management. "More than they deserved." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but holding on to anger would only have poisoned my own heart." She glanced up at him, a small smile touching her lips. "Besides, if they hadn't banished me, I would never have found my way to your ranch." The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "No, you wouldn't have," he said softly. They completed their errands in town efficiently, purchasing supplies needed at the ranch and a few small luxuries that Abigail's restitution money could now afford. As they prepared to leave, she made one last stop at the schoolhouse, leaving a package of primers and slates she had purchased for the children. The return journey felt lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from both of them. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the trail as they traveled, the wagon loaded with their purchases. "I'm proud of you," Weston said suddenly, breaking a comfortable silence. "Not many would have faced that town with such dignity." "I had good reason to be strong," she replied, glancing at him. "I knew where I belonged." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that neither was quite ready to articulate fully. Yet, as the miles passed and the ranch came into view, a sense of homecoming enveloped Abigail that had nothing to do with buildings or boundaries and everything to do with the man beside her. That evening, after supper was cleared and Isaac had retired to his quarters in the bunkhouse, Abigail and Weston sat on the porch, watching as twilight settled over the land. Fireflies began to appear in the gathering darkness, their intermittent glow punctuating the deepening night. "My father built this house," Weston said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "He came out here with nothing but determination and my mother's unwavering faith in him." Abigail turned to look at him, surprised by this unexpected glimpse into his past. In all their months together, he had rarely spoken of his family. "They were happy here," he continued, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Not wealthy, but content. I was 10 when the influenza took them both in the winter of '51. "I'm so sorry," Abigail said softly, understanding all too well the devastation of such a loss. "My uncle took over the ranch and raised me, but he had little interest in ranching and less in parenting. As soon as I was old enough, I left to make my own way. Worked as a drover, a ranch hand, whatever would put food in my belly and experience under my belt." His voice grew distant with memory. "When my uncle died 5 years ago, I came back. The ranch was in shambles, but it was mine. I've been rebuilding it ever since." "You've done a remarkable job," Abigail observed, touched that he was sharing this history with her. Weston turned to look at her then, his face half-shadowed in the fading light. "It's been lonely work," he admitted, "until recently." The implication in his words made her heart quicken. "Weston, I'm not good with words." "Abigail," he interrupted gently. "Never have been. But I need you to know that what I said that day in town wasn't just for show." She stilled, hardly daring to breathe. "What do you mean?" "When I said I'd been waiting my whole life for you, it wasn't just something to say." His voice dropped lower, intense with suppressed emotion. "I meant it. Maybe not in the way it sounded then, but I've come to mean it since." Abigail's hands trembled in her lap. "I don't understand." "Don't you?" he asked, reaching out to cover her hands with his own. "You've brought life back to this place, Abigail. Not just clean floors and good meals, but laughter and purpose. You've brought life back to me." Tears welled in her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "I was broken when I came here," she whispered. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. And you've repaid that chance 1,000 times over." His thumb traced gentle circles on her wrist. "I'm not asking out of obligation or gratitude, Abigail. I'm asking because I've come to care for you in a way I never expected." "Asking what?" she breathed, though her heart already knew. "Asking if you might consider making this arrangement permanent." His eyes, earnest and vulnerable, held hers. "Not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." The world seemed to still around them, the night sounds of the prairie fading to insignificance as Abigail absorbed his words. In the depths of her disgrace, she had believed no man would ever want her. Yet here was Weston Tanner honest, steadfast, and good, offering her not just redemption, but love. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Yes, I will." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to withdraw, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a gentle, questioning kiss. When she responded with a tremulous smile of her own, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as if she were infinitely precious. Under the vast Wyoming sky, studded with stars that had witnessed countless human dramas unfold across the untamed landscape, Abigail Grayson and Weston Tanner sealed their promise to one another. Two souls who had known loneliness, finding in each other the home they had always sought. The wedding took place on a crisp September morning, with the aspen trees beginning to turn gold against the evergreen backdrop of the distant mountains. It was a small affair, held in the yard of the ranch with only a handful of witnesses. Isaac, beaming with pride as he stood up for Weston, Reverend Parker, who had ridden out from Prosperity to perform the ceremony, Mrs. Holloway and her son Charlie, representing the renewed connections with the town, and a few neighboring ranchers with whom Weston had built friendships over the years. Abigail wore a dress of cream-colored silk that she had sewn herself from fabric purchased with part of her restitution money. Her hair, now restored to its natural auburn luster after months of good food and reduced stress, was adorned with a crown of late summer wildflowers gathered by Charlie Holloway, who had appointed himself her special helper for the day. As she walked toward Weston, who waited beneath an arch of twisted willow branches decorated with ribbons and more wildflowers, Abigail felt a sense of rightness that transcended the circumstances that had brought her to this moment. The past, with its pain and misunderstandings, was just that past. Before her stood her future, embodied in the steady gaze of the man who had seen value in her when she could see none in herself. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Parker began, his voice carrying across the ranch yard, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." The familiar words of the ceremony washed over Abigail as she stood hand in hand with Weston, their fingers intertwined in a physical representation of the bond they were formalizing. When the time came to speak her vows, her voice was clear and unwavering, filled with the certainty of her choice. "I, Abigail, take thee, Weston, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part, according to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth." Weston's response was equally steady, though Abigail detected a slight roughness in his voice that spoke of deep emotion carefully controlled. When he slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, preserved through all the years of his wandering, his hands trembled slightly, betraying the significance of the moment for this normally stoic man. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the Reverend concluded with evident satisfaction. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The small gathering erupted in cheers as Weston drew Abigail into a tender kiss that promised a lifetime of such moments. Isaac whistled appreciatively, causing Abigail to blush and Weston to grin with uncharacteristic boyishness. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous. Tables had been set up in the yard, laden with food prepared by Mrs. Holloway and several neighboring ranch wives who had taken a liking to Abigail during her occasional visits to their homes. A local fiddler provided music, and as the afternoon progressed, the yard became an impromptu dance floor. "Mrs. Tanner," Weston said, the name still new and wonderful on his lips as he led her in a somewhat stiff but sincere attempt at a waltz. "Are you happy?" Abigail looked up at him, at the face that had become dearer to her than any other. "Completely," she assured him. "Are you?" His answer came not in words, but in the tender kiss he pressed to her forehead, heedless of the onlookers. It was a gesture so unlike the reserved man she had first known that it spoke volumes about the change in him, a change she recognized because it mirrored her own transformation from broken to whole, from lost to found. As the sun began to set and their guests prepared to depart, Abigail found herself standing with Mrs. Holloway, watching as Weston helped the Reverend into his buggy. "You know," the baker's wife said thoughtfully, "when I first heard that Weston Tanner had taken you in, I feared for you. He always seemed so solitary, almost forbidding." She patted Abigail's hand with motherly affection. "But looking at him now, I can see what you saw in him all along. There's a goodness there, deep and true." "Yes," Abigail agreed, watching as her husband, how wonderful that word felt, laughed at something Isaac said. "He saved me in more ways than he knows." "And you saved him right back, I'd wager," Mrs. Holloway observed shrewdly. "That's what makes a marriage work, when the saving goes both ways." As the last guests departed, trailing good wishes and blessings in their wake, the newlyweds stood on the porch of what was now truly their home, watching as twilight settled over the land. Isaac had tactfully announced his intention to spend the night in the line cabin near the north pasture, giving them privacy for their first evening as husband and wife. "Alone at last," Weston said softly, his arm around Abigail's waist. She leaned into his embrace, still marveling at the path that had led her to this moment. "It's hard to believe, isn't it? That day in prosperity, when everything seemed lost." "I knew even then," he confessed, turning to face her fully. "Something about you called to something in me. When you cried out that no one would want you, it was like a knife to my heart, because I could already see how utterly untrue it was." The raw honesty in his voice moved her deeply. "And when you said you'd been waiting your whole life for me." "I didn't understand it then, but I felt it," he said, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite tenderness. "My heart recognized yours before my head caught up." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Weston led his bride into their home, now transformed by her presence from a mere dwelling to a place of warmth and belonging. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world as they began the private celebration of their union, two souls finding in each other the completion they had long sought, but never truly expected to find. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges to the Tanner Ranch. The harsh Wyoming winters tested their resilience, while the breathtaking beauty of spring renewals rewarded their perseverance. Through it all, Abigail and Weston's bond deepened, growing stronger with each shared triumph and hardship. In the spring following their wedding, Abigail began to feel the first stirrings of new life within her. When she shared the news with Weston, his normally composed expression gave way to such naked wonder and joy that tears sprang to her eyes. "A baby," he whispered, his hand gentle against her still flat stomach. "Our baby." Their son, James William Tanner, arrived on a cold January night in 1873, with Mrs. Holloway serving as midwife. The infant's lusty cries announced his determination to thrive in the challenging environment that would shape his character, just as it had shaped his parents. Weston, who had paced the porch through the long hours of Abigail's labor, entered the bedroom with tentative steps, his face pale with worry, until he saw Abigail's tired but radiant smile and the small bundle cradled in her arms. "Come meet your son," she invited, her voice soft with exhaustion and wonder. The hardened rancher approached with uncharacteristic hesitation. But when Abigail placed the swaddled infant in his arms, the transformation on his face was profound. Tenderness, awe, and fierce protectiveness chased across his features as he gazed down at the tiny life they had created together. "He's perfect," Weston murmured, a single tear tracking unashamedly down his weathered cheek, "just like his mother." As James grew, so did the ranch's prosperity. Weston's careful management and willingness to adopt new techniques helped them weather the economic challenges that plagued many frontier enterprises. Isaac remained with them, growing from boy to man under Weston's guidance and eventually taking on the role of foreman when additional hands were hired to handle the expanding herd. Charlie Holloway, whose reading had improved dramatically under Abigail's continued tutelage during his visits to the ranch, became a frequent playmate for young James. The two boys formed a friendship that mirrored the growing bonds between their families, bridging the gap between town and country life. When James was 3, the Tanner family welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Grace, whose delicate features and quiet nature contrasted with her brother's robust energy. Abigail, watching Weston cradle their infant daughter with the same wonder he had shown their son, reflected on the fullness of the life they had built together from such uncertain beginnings. "What are you thinking about?" Weston asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching James chase fireflies in the twilight while Elizabeth slept in her father's arms. "How fortunate we are," Abigail replied, her hand finding his, "and how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't spoken up that day." Weston's fingers tightened around hers. "I've never regretted it, not for a single moment." "Nor have I," she assured him, "though sometimes I wonder what made you do it. You barely knew me then." He was silent for a moment, considering her question with his usual thoughtfulness. "I saw something in you that reminded me of myself," he said finally. "A good person caught in bad circumstances. And perhaps," he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "perhaps I recognized the possibility of what we could become to each other, even if I didn't understand it at the time." The honesty of his answer touched her deeply. After 6 years of marriage, Weston had grown more comfortable expressing his feelings, but such moments of insight still carried special significance. "I'm glad you saw possibilities where I could see only endings," Abigail said softly. Their conversation was interrupted by James, who came running up with his hands cupped around a captured firefly. "Look, Mama! Look, Papa! I caught one!" The proud parents duly admired their son's achievement, their shared glance over his tousled head communicating their mutual joy in this simple family moment. As the children grew, so did the community around them. Prosperity expanded with the arrival of the railroad in 1876, bringing new settlers and opportunities to the region. Abigail, whose relationship with the town had gradually healed through the years, found herself increasingly involved in community affairs. Her background as a teacher proved valuable when she joined the school board, advocating for improved educational opportunities for all the area's children. Weston, while still preferring the solitude of the ranch to town gatherings, supported her endeavors with quiet pride. His own standing in the community had grown as well, his reputation for fair dealing and sound judgment earning him the respect of fellow ranchers and townspeople alike. Mr. Tanner, Mayor Wilson, now in his 3rd term, approached him after a town meeting in the summer of 1878. "The council would be honored if you would consider running for county commissioner in the fall election. We need level-headed men like yourself in positions of influence as the territory continues to grow." Weston, taken aback by the suggestion, glanced at Abigail, who stood nearby in conversation with Miss Sullivan, now Mrs. Peterson, after her marriage to the livery stable owner. "I appreciate the confidence, Mayor," he replied carefully, "but my focus has always been on my ranch and family." "Just consider it," Wilson urged. "Talk it over with your wife. The county needs leadership that understands both town and country interests." Later that evening, as they rode home with James and Elizabeth drowsing in the back of the wagon after a long day in town, Abigail broached the subject. "The mayor's suggestion has merit, you know. You would make an excellent commissioner." Weston's brow furrowed as he guided the team along the familiar road. "It would take time away from the ranch, from you and the children." "We could manage," she assured him. "Isaac is more than capable of handling things when you're away, and the children would be proud to see their father serving the community." "And what about you?" he asked, glancing at her. "Would you be proud?" The question, asked with genuine uncertainty, reminded Abigail of how far they had come, and yet how the echoes of old insecurities could still surface unexpectedly. "I am already proud of you," she said firmly. "Every day. Whether you choose to take on this role or not won't change that." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But I believe you have gifts that could benefit more than just our family. Wisdom and integrity that our growing county needs." Weston fell silent, considering her words as the wagon crested the final hill before their ranch came into view. The house, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, stood solid and welcoming in the golden light of the setting sun. The barn and outbuildings, all well-maintained and purposeful, testified to years of careful stewardship. It was a legacy to be proud of, yet perhaps not the entirety of what he could contribute. "I'll think about it," he promised, his hand finding hers on the seat between them. When the fall election came, Weston Tanner's name was indeed on the ballot, and the community's response was overwhelmingly positive. His election as county commissioner marked a new chapter in their lives, bringing new challenges and responsibilities, but also new opportunities to shape the future of the land and people they had come to love. Through it all, the political meetings, the expanded social obligations, the occasional controversies that came with public service, Abigail remained Weston's steadfast partner, offering counsel when asked and support always. Their children thrived, growing into thoughtful young people who combined their father's quiet strength with their mother's compassionate insight. In the winter of 1883, as Wyoming territory faced one of the harshest seasons in memory, the Tanner family gathered in their warm kitchen to celebrate Christmas. James, now 10 and showing signs of the man he would become, helped his 7-year-old sister string popcorn for the tree they had cut from their own land. Their youngest, 4-year-old Thomas, born after Weston's election, played contentedly with wooden animals his father had carved for him. Abigail, watching her family from the doorway with a cup of hot cider in her hands, felt a wave of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes. The journey from that desperate day in prosperity to this moment of profound contentment seemed almost miraculous in retrospect. Weston, catching her expression as he entered from checking on the livestock one final time before the expected storm, crossed to her side with the same quiet purposefulness that had characterized his approach that fateful day 12 years earlier. "What is it?" he asked softly, his arm slipping around her waist with the easy familiarity of long companionship. "I was just thinking about how far we've come," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "About all we've built together." His eyes, still as clear and honest as they had been on that first day, held hers with deep understanding. "The best decision I ever made was walking up to that platform and offering you a place at my ranch." "And the best decision I ever made was accepting," she returned, turning to face him fully. "No regrets?" he asked, a hint of teasing in his voice, though the question held genuine inquiry beneath. "Not one," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to press a kiss to his lips, now familiar territory mapped by years of such gestures, yet never diminished in their power to connect them. From across the kitchen came the sound of their children's laughter, bright and clear against the gathering storm outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light over the home they had created, not just the physical structure, but the web of love, trust, and shared history that sheltered them all. Outside, snow began to fall, each flake a tiny miracle of complexity and beauty, accumulating gradually into a transformative blanket across the landscape. Like those snowflakes, the small daily choices and moments of courage had accumulated over the years, transforming two wounded souls into a family bound by love that had withstood every challenge. As Weston and Abigail joined their children around the Christmas tree, their hands naturally finding each other's in a gesture as instinctive as breathing, the words spoken so long ago echoed between them, not as desperate cry and unexpected answer now, but as promise fulfilled and future still unfolding. "No one will want me now. I've been waiting my whole life for you. A chance encounter, a moment of courage. A choice to believe in possibility rather than surrender to despair." From these seeds had grown a life neither could have imagined in their darkest hours. As the blizzard raged beyond their walls, the Tanner family remained safe in the shelter of the home and love they had built together, proof that even in the wild uncertainty of the frontier, hearts could find their way to where they truly belonged.